As of July 15th, 2023, the family computer is now 40 years old. It is just such a cool console and the sibling to what we know well in the West as the Nintendo Entertainment System. To commemorate the occasion, I thought it would be fun to point out some Famicom fun facts, just look at the console and its games and go over some of those things that I find interesting. And so without further ado, let's jump right in. Released on July 15th, 1983, the first couple production runs of the Famicom actually had square, rubbery A and B buttons, which would later be changed to the hard plastic circle buttons that we know well today. The reason for this change is that the corners of the square buttons would often get stuck inside the controller, as well as the rubber that the buttons were made from would gradually wear down as more games were played. I'm sure that's a problem I would have encountered by this point. Thank goodness for that change. I think they made the right one. Imagine the Super Nintendo controller with square buttons. Probably wouldn't be all that great. Both the Famicom and Disk System included mini mangas which go over how the consoles work, even giving an inside look at each of the chips and explaining how they operate. Unfortunately, we never had an equivalent to this in the West with the NES, but if you want to read these for yourselves, I will link down in the description to translated versions. One big difference with the Famicom is that the controllers are actually attached to the console, unlike with the NES where the ports on the front allow you to plug in whatever controllers you want. You can actually unplug the controllers on the Famicom as well, however it requires opening up the console and then from there you can do any exchanges that you like. The second player's controller on the Famicom also lacks a start and select button and instead includes a microphone built in, which is needed in some games. For cases where a peripheral is required to play a game, there is still one port on the front of the Famicom, which can be used to plug in things like the light gun, or the keyboard, or even an additional controller, should you not wish to use one of the ones built into the console. Famicom cartridges come in all different colors and look really nice when lined up on the shelf. I love that additional level of character that each cart ends up having as a result of that custom color chosen for each game. One downside, however, compared to our standard gray cart NES library that we got in the West, is that Famicom cartridges tend not to have top labels, meaning that to find that game you want to play, you're gonna have to be pulling all of them off the shelf. So it's a trade-off that has to be made. What do you think? Would you rather have the colorful cartridges or ones with top labels like we got? Let me know down in the comments below. Anyone who's looked at retro Famicom games may have noticed that there's something missing compared to what our games got in the West. That's right, there is no Nintendo seal of quality in Japan. You will instead find a symbol depicting two letter Fs, standing for Famicom Family. This was in response to the fact that there was lots of piracy back in the day. Everyone wanted a piece of that Famicom pie. It was just huge in Japan. And there's no lockout chip on the Famicom like we had with the NES in the West. So naturally, piracy was quite rampant. But a little bit into the Famicom's life, Nintendo introduced this Famicom Family symbol to let the consumer know that what they were buying was an officially licensed product. It can be a bit confusing, however, considering that there was quite a few games released before the symbol was introduced, so it's not always a surefire way to tell if what's in your hands is the real deal or not. It's even featured on the console itself, because believe it or not, it wasn't just the games that were getting bootlegged, it was the console as well. Another problem with the Famicom Family logo is that it was not often found on third-party games. There was a lot more leniency in Japan in regards to what companies could do when producing their Famicom games, unlike in the West where everything was standardized, looked the same, used the same sort of chips. In Japan, cartridges could look however the company wanted, and they could also use whatever chips they wished to inside of their games. That's why you get things like Castlevania 3 in Japan, where it has a custom sound chip that allows the Famicom to make music that you otherwise would never have been able to hear. But when it came to the West, they had to use Nintendo stock chips when assembling their games, so you lose that special sound chip, and instead, the soundtrack had to be retuned accordingly. The creativity that companies were allowed to incorporate into their games in Japan, though, was just so cool, and I love these third-party cartridges. Some of them even corrected Nintendo's initial mistake and add top labels to their games, so they are that much easier to find when looking for them on the shelf. Konami in particular was one company that was really good for this, adding top labels to their games. Putting third-party cartridges aside though, here's a trick that you can use on first-party Famicom games. Say you're at your local Japanese Famicom game store, no doubt we all have one of those down the street, and you're trying to find a Famicom game that maybe you can enjoy even without knowledge of the Japanese language. You don't want to pull an RPG off the shelf because naturally that might be a bit tough. And if you assume that in most cases RPGs have a save functionality, this is a way you can tell if that cartridge in your hand is good for you. If you flip over a standard designed Famicom cartridge and see a label on the back with blue characters, that means that that cartridge does not include a save backup battery. Flip over another one, and if you have red characters, that means that that game can save. This is very similar to NES cartridges where flipping them over and having a gray sticker means it does not have a save battery, while having a gold sticker means it does have save backup capabilities. Of course, this isn't a surefire way to know if your game's gonna be an RPG or not. Let's look at the back of Dragon Warrior 1 and 2, and you will find that they actually have blue labels. So what's this, Andrew? You're lying to me. Clearly, Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 must have save backup capabilities. They're RPGs after all, and fairly decent length ones at that. But did you know that in Japan, rather than save backup, Dragon Quest 1 and 2 actually had a password system to record your progress? That's right! By the time we got Dragon Warrior 1 in the West, Dragon Quest 3 was actually out in Japan, so our Dragon Warrior 1 included all sorts of quality of life improvements, graphical improvements. It was just basically a definitive edition that we got compared to the original release in Japan. Characters don't even face different directions in the Famicom Dragon Quest release. To talk to NPCs, you actually have to stand beside them, open up the menu, select talk, and then select if who you want to talk to is to the up, down, left, or right of you, since you can't actually face them for the game to just naturally know. So to wrap things up, I just want to look at a few Famicom cartridges in my collection that I find particularly cool. Salamander, which is the Japanese version of Life Force that we got in the West, comes in a really cool clear cartridge, lets you see everything that's going on in there. Most people are likely familiar with the fact that the Nintendo Entertainment System has a light on the front that will turn on when the console is on. However, the Famicom had no such thing. Never fear though, as early IREM cartridge releases actually have a light built into them that will turn on when the console is on. Isn't that so cool? Like, it's so over the top that a company would take the initiative and add a light to their games since the console didn't have one originally. I love that. Here we have Dragon Buster, comes in a shiny gold cartridge, looks very nice. Zelda in Japan didn't come in a gold cartridge, but Dragon Buster did. I know this is part of a series. I'd love to dive more into it someday. Don't actually know all that much about it, but the gold cartridge really catches your attention, and hopefully it's as good as the cartridge would make you think it is. This card is interesting because it is actually a bootleg, and one of the quick ways that you can tell that is because if we compare it to an official Famicom cart of the same design, it is supposed to have 2 holes in the top, which the bootleg does not have. Flipping it around, we'll also see that not only is there no Famicom family logo, the back label is completely wrong, instead giving a lot of weird warnings, including not taking your cartridge for a candlelit dinner, not taking your cartridge to court, not using your cartridge as a bar of soap, and most importantly, not feeding your cartridge to an alligator. Clearly this must be the Florida Man edition of the game. And just like there was no standard cartridge design for Famicom games, the case design or box design could also have some variations. Sometimes you got your standard cardboard boxes, where other times they came in plastic clamshell cases to keep that book and stuff all safe and protected. I think it's really cool when games have something like this, as is the case here with Megami Tensei. Also, speaking of cartridges, perhaps you don't have a Famicom, but you want to play some Famicom games. There's all sorts of converters that you can find, which will convert the 60-pin Famicom cartridges to be playable on your 72-pin NES consoles, and we've even looked in the past on another video in my channel about how you can open up some NES cartridges and find official Nintendo Famicom to NES converters inside and use those to play your Famicom games. So if you want to hear more about that and how to find those converters for yourself, be sure to check that video, which I'll link to. But with that, those are some fascinating Famicom fun facts that I thought would be fun to share with you all, and I hope that you enjoyed it. This is by no means an exhaustive list. You could go on all day about cool things that have to do with the Famicom. So what do you think are some neat things in that regard? Please feel free to comment down below. I'll be very happy to read and reply to them. And otherwise, if you want to see more content like this, please consider liking and subscribing. So thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed, and hope to see you next time for something different. Thanks again, and see you later, everyone.